Oh, list. Maybe then it just
Well,
needs to say,
it's start time.
assumption is that
It's go time.
whoever is running those CSP also has to be the entity that maintains the alt list. And then when we're doing
Are we live?
We're not actually checking the certificate.
Check.
They need to be able to access it. They need to be able to check it.
Right, fair enough. And then this check that this extension goes to CSP, it may not actually have anything to do with.
Oh, we're not on the screen. Why are we not on the screen?
We say, yeah, so again, and we do say that in the graph, semantics is slightly different. Like we CSPs for is this certificate still valid? This is a different question. Is this certificate still valid and is it valid for the following number that we go through as a system? I think we do say that.
I did somewhere. Okay, so.
If not, I
found this part not clear. That's my.
This is how it's supposed to work. Okay. And I think it works. I think
No, I suspect it does, but like, yeah, okay. The other, I guess, fundamental assumption is that you're not really using the use case or the certificate includes the phone numbers because that thing will change so much. Like that, honestly, like.
So there are.
You don't need to send the phone number; it's in the.
There are cases where this works, and I'll say this in my slides. Jack Richard from.
Maybe that's like a TV that has a light on to tell you that it's, you know, that it can have it.
Microsoft. Like, you keep with the text on, get their what options are.
Right.
I still think there's a use case like with Newstar. This had 571, 434, 1,000, 2,000, those 1,000 lines.
Right.
I think there's still a use case for the enterprise that's really simple like that.
Yeah.
Where you're just like, I'm going to put those in as labels. Right. And you can imagine similarly something that had a larger number, such that you wouldn't necessarily want to make it server. Basically, same thing. Yeah. In which case, I think the normal AI case, which is not like the original
Should we let John and JDR have the meeting? Welcome, everyone. It is start time. Hello, start time. It's start time. You're already having the meeting, right? Are you taking minutes? You know, just a second. I need to get something and then. Okay, so we have minute takers. Thank Chris and Simon. We don't have anyone to camp on Zulip. Is there someone that would do that just to watch to see if anyone needs it channeled to the mic? Okay. I mean, I think most people will be coming through Meet Echo anyway, so it won't really matter. But, and again, thank Chris and Simon as our note takers. Yay. You want to drive? You want me to drive?
You drive.
I mean, or talk. Okay. Go, you talk. I'll drive.
All right. Note well. By this point in the week, I'm sure you've all seen this. I don't see anybody wearing a one-day pass. But please make sure that you do honor the rights, privileges, and responsibilities that are listed in the note well. Keep going. Code of conduct, please keep it to technical discussions and not personal attacks. Next slide. So please remember that we have remote participants, and please follow the protocol so that they can be full participants as well. Next slide.
Don't forget to sign into.
Oh, and please sign in to Vitaco. Use the QR code, use the blue sheet QR code, or just go in through your phone and click it in there. But, you know, we want to make sure we get a bigger room next time.
And please use the queuing tool because we do have some remote people, I think.
Okay, next slide. So right now we have one document in Auth 48. It got clicked in the last, since we updated these slides. And we have one with the RFC editor that is waiting for the SIP core call info RCD document to catch up. During the social, we nudged the SIP core chair, so hopefully that'll be moving along. And we have STIR messaging is in with the ISG, and then we have the out of band work, which is basically already been last called. We're waiting to make sure that no one's going to scream at this point. Does anyone expect to review this document that has not already?
Hey, I
Go
just approved STIR messaging, so it's off to the RFC editor.
Nice.
All right, thank you. Awesome. All right, so the section 2 is now void.
It's a successful meeting. We can go home.
All right, so does anyone expect to review service provider OOB that has not already done so? All right, then we will move that one forward. Next slide.
I'm waiting for this. So-
Okay, so here's the agenda for today. The Administravia we just already dealt with. Thank you. And so we're going to talk about connected identity. We're going to talk about OCSP. And then we have other business, where we think we're going to hear about an MLS approach. Yes.
So Agenda Bash, Murray's only going to be with us for about another 25 minutes. If anybody knows of anything that needs the AD to engage in the conversation, push it to the front, please.
You got me for another 53. I'll leave it about 10:30.
Hi, this is John Peterson, not using the tool to talk. But Murray, you know, this last thing is OOB about STIR and MLS. Just as a heads up, there probably will be some like interface between the STIR working group and the MLS working group for the things we're going to need to do for that. So I don't know how you want to approach that from a cross area perspective or whatever, but just letting you know.
I don't, but I'll figure it out.
Okay. Do we need to do that? We don't need to push that forward.
I just want to make sure he do.
Okay.
All right. Any other bashes? All right. Hearing none, we'll start with the first of those, connected identity.
Morning, everyone. Thanks for showing up here at the end of the IETF. It's always great to do this on Friday morning. I got my bags. I'm leaving directly from here to the airport, but this is a fun way to cap off a lovely IETF week. So next slide, please. And Jonathan, you might as well just get in the queue like preemptively, since he sent a nice mail this morning, which is filled with good thoughts that we're all going to talk about. But just for those of you in this room who are not familiar with what we're doing with this, here's the idea. Basically, when we specified STIR and Shaken initially, it was really focused on like how you set up a call, right? This is trying to beat things like robocalling, spoofing, things like that. We thought it would be handy if there was actually a way to address some further use cases that weren't in STIR's initial scope that had to do with responses. And, you know, doing connected identity, as we call it, figuring out who the party is that you actually reached when you place a call and getting some kind of security indication from them in the backwards direction. This is a classic problem. In fact, it's so classic that even back when we did that ill-fated document called RFC 4474, Cullen and I worked on ever so long ago now, a guy by the name of John Elwell came up with a whole complex connected identity system for how you'd be able to figure out like who is on the other side and how to substitute like, you know, all the necessary parts of the dialogue syntax of SIP to make that work. But we need this for STIR, and there's a reason why. It's because there are a set of interesting attacks. These are largely fraud attacks. You see these largely in mobile networks around things like route hijacking, where it's like I'm trying to call my bank, and someone has somehow managed to make sure that this gets routed instead to an attacker. Wouldn't it be great if you had an indication from your bank of who they were? Call stretching and similar attacks. These are cases, again, in mobile networks that are unfortunately endemic, where people try to make it look like the call is a little bit longer to one end than the other, and then they kind of pocket the distance, the difference in between those in terms of the revenue you get for these calls, because on some international links, it can be quite expensive to go through that. And so even just shaving like a second off of a few million calls, it all adds up. And if you were just able to figure out who sent the buy, right? If you were just able to authenticate even where the buy came from, that would be great for fixing things like that. And also this little thing we did called SIP Brandy, which is looking at a way to get a full security stack for SIP needs this. So there's a bunch of things that are motivating this. It did take us beyond our initial threat model, initial charter, but we fixed that. So that's what we're talking about. Next slide. Now, the way that LL did this required a lot of pracs and acts and complicated things. And ultimately, I think we decided in this group it would be unlikely to be deployed if we just updated that for RFC 8224. So instead, we came up with this new notion. Let's have a new passport type. It's called RSP. And let's just assume that in the majority of the use cases that we're interested in, the routing of requests and responses is fairly symmetrical. It's likely to go through the same SBCs residing at the edges of networks. So like, why don't we just say, hey, you can just put in provisional responses, even in final responses, and certainly in any mid-dialogue or dialogue altering requests, like something that, an identity header, and that identity header may have different semantics when it's in a response. And for that case, we have defined a new passport type, which is called RSP. And RSP basically can only be used for these responses. And yeah, we think that this is a much simpler solution. I'm not going to go into all the details of that solution today, but feel free to read the draft. That's basically the direction this has taken. I'm now thinking this is fairly mature and probably pretty close to being ready to ship, but I understand there's some questions about it. So next slide. I think all I have left is there is a new version that we just put out. Russ, thank you very much for your thorough review, pointing out that I hadn't bothered to actually end a lot of sentences and so on. We're no longer targeting this really like it's updating RFC 4916. This is now orthogonal. We're not going to bother to change the ID name from RFC 4916 update because that would not go into the RFC ultimately, right, when this actually gets published. But yeah, so I took out the change log. I filled in the back matter, clarified some things about non-dialogue forming responses, especially 3xx's, because that is really the purview of the diversion work, which we've previously done. And we have a whole kind of separate thing we want to do to try to secure diversion in those cases. Next slide. So yeah, barring anybody having long emails they send, a few minutes before the meeting starts, I thought this was ready to go. But Jonathan, please talk to us a bit about some of your concerns about this. And you can feel free to bring in your laptop as a more.
As evidence. All right. So one, I guess a high level comment, which is just an observation to see if it's accurate, is there is an additional, what's that? It's not. Is that actually, do you know? Okay. It could. All right. No, of course not. So there's an interesting use case that we often place phone calls for verifying someone's number. So if you sign up at a website and you put in your phone number as your identity, the system will text you, or you have the option to call you. And this is widely used, as we all know, as a form of 2FA. There's been complaints by lots of security folks, such as I'm sure Ecker over here, that there's various attacks possible in the network for diverting phone calls and SIM stealing and whatever that introduce the possibility that those are actually not valid. And so it seemed like this might be helpful in some of the cases where those attacks are launched, where you can imagine the caller is not a human, but it's a bot. And the only thing it really cares about is verifying that the response, 200OK response, has exactly the same phone number in it in the RSP passport that the call is placed to. That's it. This seemed like a really useful use case for this, possibly more useful than any other thing we've discussed so far. I wanted to this will work for that, right? This is a good use case.
It will. And now that we're starting to look more at messaging as well, I think there's a story for that, which is perhaps an even more common case. That this works with messaging. Of course, that'll require that messaging infrastructure to be implemented, and that'll take a bit. But the levers are starting, thumb screws are starting to be turned on that.
Okay. So then, if we all concur this is a useful use case, my ask would be one, just maybe a paragraph of text in the intro quoting this use case. It does have some implications on the spec, which leads to one of my comments, which was that the draft currently requires that, unless I misunderstood, that's why there's a question, that the receiver of the call pass backwards the RSP, it sends the RSP passport, but also there must be a div passport in there as well.
Only when the desk has been changed.
Only when the desk has been changed. Okay.
And forwarded or
Okay. So I read this paragraph that had this requirement in it twice, and to me it was ambiguous that that's actually the case. And I can quote the text why that is. It's 2 sentences, and the second one that introduces the requirement does not
have div in it.
Does not actually say like that.
Yeah.
Only it just makes the blanket statement that it has to be there in the response. So okay, so only if there were divs in there must they be sent backwards. Okay, if you clarify that, I think that helps, because the case I'm most interested in is like no one in the middle even heard of the div thing. There were diversions, there were not diversions, but there's no divs. This thing could still be useful.
I mean, what I do want to hedge against again is cases where if there weren't divs, like, in other words, a generation of div passports that secure the forwarding, I'm very concerned about accepting it, right, if a diversion happened, but there were no divs in it. And I'm sure you can see why. Because, I mean, there are a very obvious set of cases where, well, I'm the proper respondent to this, and like, you should just trust me, even though a forwarding event happened.
No,
So
it's goodness. It's goodness.
Yeah, okay.
But what's interesting is for this particular use case, like forwarding it all is bad. So as soon as divs present or not, if the RSP passport is there and it doesn't match, I'm not going to use this at all. I'm going to literally hang up the call.
Do you think even if there's a signed div, and again, what does a signed div really say? It says, this was supposed to go here. I am the entity that is responsible for where this is supposed to go. I am cryptographically attesting it is okay if it goes here. Even in that case, you're like, no way?
For this use case,
Interesting. Okay.
yeah. I would assert, but this is exactly then can you remember the thing we're trying to assess at the originator is verify ownership of the phone number.
I got
right? And that requires that the person who gave me the number has some code they're about to press in.
I got it.
Or something, or press pound or whatever. Like, I don't know who the hell got this thing. Like, they could have gone and hacked a forwarding rule. Like, I hacked my account to do the forwarding of a call. Someone hacked my account to forward the call and then was able to claim ownership of the phone number. They would pass the number check in this case, and I don't want them to do that.
Yeah. I mean, whenever we get into these questions where it's like, if somebody compromised a system, if somebody compromised the actual system that owned the telephone number that is for this, like, what do you do? I mean, the same could be said if they compromised the system where there was no diversion, right? And
Fair
these 10 times.
But the point is, none of this matters for the draft, by the way. This all would not be in this document at all. I'm stating there's a use case here. People who build this verification application will need to make their decisions about what they do with divs. That's great. It's not in scope for the document.
And I will also say that is my second line of defense is we don't tell you who to trust or why. And if your system is not going to trust the entity generates divs, no problem. And I don't think anything in the document tells you you are obligated to trust anyone, right? Because we don't tend to say that in the IETF.
Just to respond to Jonathan's use case a little bit, like, as a person who lives outside the US and is constantly forced to impersonate that I have a US billing credit card with a US billing address so that I can get any service I want, I am very glad that I can forward my SMS and my voicemail from a US number to outside of the US. So I think you'd have a set of users with a mixed set of requirements in this. I totally get the point you're making. But if I chose to forward my phone number to something else where I could receive it, there might be, I might want to receive what went to it and still have it sort of look much like I could still authenticate from that phone number, but whatever.
Okay. I mean, so definitely what I would take away from this, and I think what the minute should take away, I'm certainly happy to document this particular, TFA use case, both for voice and probably with an allusion to messaging. And I think we can find a place to emphasize in the text that the IETF does not tell you who to trust or why. Chris?
Chris Went. I'm just wondering, are we talking about validating the called number or the forwarded to number? And are we clear about that?
So for the TFA case, you're effectively, you were validating the called number. And this is what's making
Yeah.
Jonathan concerned, right? Because if the called number gets forwarded to something else, and that's a place where you're then
But
gonna
are you
enter-
validating it from the forwarded to number or the called number, I guess is what I'm
you're
just
validating
wondering
it
if
for,
we're
you're
clear-
validating
clear
for the
about-
number you put in that the TFA is, right, like associated with.
Yeah. Okay. I'm just making sure we're clear about that.
I mean, this gets ambiguous too, because I mean, some of these baiting callback attacks, right? You really are mostly just making sure that that service that is doing the callback, you know, when it connects, it's getting the right assurance that the number it tried to reach is a number that in fact you're connected to punch in the code or whatever. Personally, I think the security of it should be sufficient for most applications, and it does help people like in Cullen's situation. But I also think we can be very agnostic and say people don't want to trust one of these. They have any divs in it, don't trust it.
Yeah, so I think just like to sharpen the point or Chris Gola, to sharpen the point you're just making, the security of the system for telephony, let's just deal with telephony for a second. Sorry, for like, you know, phone calls, depends on the validating authority, the validating entity believing they've reached the person they're trying to reach on the other end, right? So you obviously need a chain of like approval all the way down the line. One thing, I guess I don't know enough about the messaging case. Like I don't know how messaging really works. But like, is there in fact in like SMS some sort of like, you know, as there is with voice, is there actually some like confirmation of the person you're reaching, or is it just kind of going to the ether and like you don't get to hear back?
Oh, I mean, today it totally goes in the ether. You have no idea.
Right. So I think that like, it's not. I think that trying to provide this assurance for SMS is going to be very difficult. Even if in telephony, even if in phone calls it works, right? And because
so the way we expect that would probably be out of band. In other words, CPS is where we start for the SMS in particular.
Yeah.
Unless SMPP is going to carry this through these service bureaus, which I really doubt. So what this would instead look like is that, you know, the passport exchange would be happening from the remote side by it pushing the token that says like, hey, you reached the right place.
You don't need this draft at all for that.
You don't need this draft for all for that. Yeah.
right, I'm just trying to reason about like the alleged assurance provided in the voice case is you were like on the phone with like the right person, and the assurances you get in the SMS case, I'm a little unsure what they would consist of. Like a message delivered to this dude is only delivered to this dude, blah, blah. So like, it's probably a little more complicated, but
well, I put it this way too. Like imagine that all that moved to MLS and we lived in an MLS-based world and these things happen via MLS, provided that the entity participating or like in the room has the credential for the telephone number in question, right? Then I think everyone
100% agree.
think of it more like that.
Yeah,
That's where we're trying to get.
Yeah, absolutely, no question. Yeah, no question, but I do agree.
Quick reminder, I know some people came in after we started. Please remember to log in through the tool, and also please use the queuing tool. We do have some people monitoring remotely, and the tool makes it a lot easier for them to tell who's talking.
Yeah, it looks like we have a queue. Who else is in the queue?
Eric, are you finished in the queue?
Hey, Jonathan.
Yeah, Jonathan Lennox. I'm just curious, is this something where the various regulators are going to require this as well? Because I suspect that if they don't, nobody's going to, the providers are not terribly enthusiastic about yet another implementation. So,
You know, I for some reason don't feel like I want to speak to regulators and what they might or might not do here at the microphone. There
Fair enough.
was an FNPRM that the FCC issued here in the United States that referenced messaging and asked specifically about the role in STIR for messaging.
no,
And so there is interest.
Connected identity, though.
Oh, connected identity. So regulatory, in some cases, yes, because of this like IRSF and like all these like call stretching kinds of things. I think there may be places that we end up seeing that come into play, but right now the main places that I'm talking about that are industry associations that are highly affected by those specific set of fraud attacks. And so there is a community for this, and like, you know, they're losing a lot of money to this right now.
And Jonathan Rosenberg, and interesting to note that this other use case may motivate some, I mean, speculating, like, you know, makes it more attractive for a regular, oh, wow, okay. This also helps make, you know, phone number verification more secure, which again, as I've said many times at the mic, is the foundation of all security on the web.
Yes.
So anything we can do here to make it better is good. The second comment I made in my email was that the draft requires that the caller insert regular passports, I guess not div passports, in mid-dialogue requests for this thing. And I don't feel super strongly about that as a must, but it occurs to me it's a little bit of an asymmetric thing. Like this whole draft is about solving a problem, is about imposing requirements on the called party about what they should do to provide assurances should the originator want it. But the originator didn't ask, there's nothing in this draft about the originator requesting it or whatever. So it seems like weird to me that if I'm someone that only ever places outbound calls, that all of a sudden, just because the other guy decided to send me a passport, I now have to start sending passports in my mid-dialogue requests. Like, that just struck me as this is fundamentally an asymmetric protocol, and imposing symmetric requirements didn't make sense to me.
Yeah,
so I would put it as a should, not a must.
I'd be comfortable relaxing that. I mean, earlier versions of this had like option tags and supported and required and everything, so you can kind of negotiate support for this. I threw all that out to make this kind of much more just, if you've got it, do it. So I could go to should for that.
And same with cancel.
Yeah, didn't I say we took cancel out of scope? I thought I'd.
No, it says if the cancels originated by the UAC, then you still have to put the passport in it.
Really? I thought I nixed that.
The whole thing. No, it
Well,
won't.
that's just an editorial error then, because I took cancel out entirely. Or I tried to at some point.
Okay. I mean, it was in the draft I reviewed this morning. So.
Okay. Yeah, that I meant to take that out. That actually, please do minute that, because I tried to take cancel out of this entirely a while ago. Same reason that I take 4XX and 6XX out of this, right? Like, I'm interested in things that are related to dialogues being formed and and that stuff. So, okay. Anything that's going to result in the dialogue not being formed, I don't care about. Robert?
What you just said is the right way to look at it. Technically, that also means not just cancel, you need to make sure that you're not relying on any non-AX to non-200s, right?
Yeah. I mean, I started thinking about a lot of HERF stuff at one point around this, and that's when I was like, that's why we can't do cancels. Yeah, among many other things in this.
Do you want me to click the thing?
I'm sorry, we've got Pierce in queue.
Pierce in queue.
Yeah, that's why.
No, I get it.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Pierce.
Mr. Gorman, I wish you were here. I miss you. I haven't seen you in like ages.
Pierce, if you're talking, we can't hear you.
We can't hear you, Pierce.
Let's do the inside passport.
Yeah.
So Pierce, if you are talking, we can't hear you, so we're going to go next in the queue. If you can't get it where you can talk, then if you post in the
send a
chat,
message in this
and someone can relay for you.
Yeah.
Good, Jonathan.
All right, my last comment, and I'll just read the text. It says mid-dialogue requests also require special handling in diversion cases. Implementations compliant with this specification must validate the div chain back to the RSP passport on any identity header field values received in responses. This is the same comment I made previously. Like, I don't think we should mandate at that strength doing this. In the use case I described, it's totally not necessary. And by the way, I don't think we'll ever see divs. So
We see a lot of div in the wild, man.
okay. Still, I mean, again, I would leave that up to the policy.
I am shocked by how much div in the wild there is in the US.
I mean, okay, wow, that pleases me, but I'm surprised. Yeah.
But yeah, I think basically, I mean, what we're trying to express there is, don't trust these things if like you're not going to bother to do the div chain, right? That's a very different matter than that you should be forced to consume it.
So Pierce, let's try again.
Okay, can you hear me this time?
Can hear you, Pierce. How's it going, man?
It's going well, and thank you for your kind words, John. I appreciate that. I always enjoy talking with you as well. So Jonathan Rosenberg asked or made a remark that caught my attention and I wanted to confirm if I understood correctly. And it was that it was about the asynchronous operation of connected identity, where it sounded like a called party would volunteer the RSP passport in response to a call attempt, but they wouldn't have been notified by the caller that the caller required or would like to have a RSP passport response. Did I understand that correctly?
Yeah, like I said, we used to have required and supported in this. And so you can actually use SIP option tags to express precisely that semantics, right? Say like, I'm going to require this from the person I'm connecting to, and I want the session torn down if you can't do it, right? And we largely back that stuff out. If people think that's a useful semantic to restore, we could do that. I mean, I will say this, from a policy perspective, I can imagine if you are placing a call to a sensitive entity, if you're calling your bank and like, you want to make sure things work. Obviously, if what you get back from the bank and the 200 does not contain a passport and you don't have the equivalent of a green check mark from them, you might decide, I really don't want to have this conversation or to reveal sensitive financial data over this conversation. But right now, we have not enforced that at a protocol level. That is at a human policy level.
Okay, 100% understand now, I think. And I'm thinking of, how would this operate in real life? I'm hoping that the bank isn't looking at a shaken passport. I'm hoping that the bank is looking at a RCD passport. And I think it would be polite if the caller could tell the bank, or if the bank was calling this, look at it in the reverse direction. The bank fraud department's calling me. I would really like it if the bank would use an RCD passport so I could get identity information about them, not their telephone number, but their actual identity. And then if they could let me know that they needed to see the RSP in response, because this is, I'm a politically exposed person. This is really important to me. I would like them to tell me that they need an RSP passport so that I could make sure that I'm providing those.
Well, I mean,
but
the
I
way
would
you
expect
do
to
that
see it
is
in
with,
I would expect to see it in the passport. I wouldn't want to see it in the other mechanisms that you mentioned, because I agree that those my experience has been that those can be problematic. The required.
Yeah, so I mean, you're proposing effectively we add a new passport element that would go out with the invite with the RCD passport sent by the bank that would then signal to effectively the authentication service on the far side that we need to do connected identity. Is that what you're proposing, or?
Yeah, and I would try to figure out how to do it with whatever's all in RCD already. I mean, it might be kind of dumb and ugly, but yes, maybe write it into an ADIS document.
Honestly, yeah. I mean, if we're going to do this, I'd rather do it with required and supported at the SIP layer than do it in the passports, even though we know there are these out-of-bandish cases where that could be problematic. And like for SMS, for example, you're not going to be able to convey that if it's not like something that gets stuck in the CPS. But like, yeah, Jonathan.
Yeah, Jonathan Rosenberg. No, I agree. I don't think the originating STIR passport is a place this is signaling. This is not a property of the identity of the caller. It's a request for this call. It'll vary from call to call. So what I think Pierce is saying is like, oh, if I call my bank, I want them to put the RSP in the reverse thing. But if I'm calling Bob, I don't care. That doesn't change who I am.
Well, he was flipping it though. It's much more if the bank's calling you.
Oh, if the bank's calling me.
And so you're seeing their RCD passport when it shows up. Should there be some way for them to express criticality so that they don't feel like, they want to have this conversation with you unless they're getting connected?
But that still would still be, okay, fair enough, but it's still, my statement is still accurate. I think this is not a property of identity.
Just tear it down.
It's a property of signaling. If you want this, then you should either put a like new header, like please send me your RSP, true or false, or just put supported as basically an indicator that I'd like this. It would have to be
required in this instance.
But I don't know. Require is like, I think require is really wrong for this, right? Because it's gonna cause all these calls to fail.
It'll cause like half the calls to fail.
This is useful only under the condition where you have a authentication service that supports RSP, but is only sometimes putting it in, and it will only put it in if asked. Now, if that's true, then you need signaling. If we believe what's going to happen is if an authentication service supports this, they'll always put it in no matter what, then you don't need any signaling.
Agreed. And that's the world I would like to get to with this, right? But okay, Chris.
Right, I agree. I think we're pretty much there already. Most of this stuff is enforced by SBCs and the people's networks anyways. So what are you going to do if it's required? Are you going to hang up the call or,
I mean, I can tell you this in our implementation, this would be a global switch in our policy manager. You just turn on like RSP for everything, right? And like that's just how you do it. So I don't know, Pierce. Well, send a mail if you want to make a bigger case for this. I think probably the tools we have exist, and it would just be like a hassle to either do the SIP negotiation. And for the passport itself, I mean, remember too, this is a case where like the passport is being consumed by the verification service, right, on the terminating end. And then, exactly how much interface there's going to be between that VS and the AS that would be signing in the backwards direction, these responses, we're stipulating it's likely that they're the same box, or at least the same SBC that is then talking to ASs and VSs through its HTTP interfaces. But like it'll be keeping state to do that, right? And it's just much easier to say like, nah, we're just going to send RSPs, right, for like everything that comes out of this, than to like bother on a call by call basis to keep state and say, well, this call needs an RSP and this one does not. Ben,
Yeah,
This has Ben pretending to be from the floor. So I think I just heard people say that their preferred universe is one where the callee just automatically responds with RSP passport. And I also heard people talking about RCD. And when you combine those two, I start worrying about privacy issues. I don't necessarily want to identify that I'm the one who answered the call automatically. I want the choice.
Well,
because we're talking about identifying a person, not a
policy.
Yeah, we're starting to talk about identifying a person, not just a phone number.
No, but the RCD is not necessarily going to identify a person.
It doesn't have to, but it might.
So if it's like I'm calling, Bank of America, right, and they're sending me RCD in the backwards direction, in their response, like it doesn't necessarily say this is Joe Smith at Bank of America, right? You're going to get a Bank of America logo and everything else.
So I'm thinking about when bill collectors are us.
Yeah.
Calls
unfortunately
Joe Blow
case for this,
and Joe Blow answers the phone and wants to say wrong number. He can't. Now, that's a privacy issue. Maybe we don't think it's legitimate, but it's a privacy issue.
But Joe Blow is not sending RCD.
Well, Joe Blow isn't, but here's the interesting question. Forget the B2C cases, the C2B case. The C2B cases, it's clear that this is great. And as someone who works for a contact center company, I am very excited about connected identity to help customers calling up contact centers. It's the consumer-to-consumer case that's interesting. So would you expect if I just called Cullen that his mobile operator is going to insert this thing in the 200 OK, and if Cullen wasn't in my address book, and I just called the number, now I would know that this is Cullen Jennings. That is a privacy consideration, because it would allow forget the bill collector case, it would allow someone to sort of take a phone number and invert the name by just calling the number. And that's definitely worrisome. Wow, there's a party even.
Yes, it's a little party in the back of the room. Tie-dye Friday, but Michelle has a particularly sparkly little jacket on, so it's scintillating sparks.
Michelle, would you like to come forward so you can be on the camera for the remote participants?
Please, Michelle.
Michelle Cotton with the Secretariat. There you go. Enjoy.
But getting back to this, yeah, I mean, there are policies that govern how RCD gets provisioned, right? And I think there's going to be a separate layer of humans interacting with those systems, with their carriers, for what I think is the very limited use case, the CDC use case, where like literally consumers want to have their name and their picture shared with like everybody that they talk to. We know that, iMessage or like the iCloud infrastructure overall can provide some similar properties, but those are all opt-in properties. It's like you do nothing. for the C2C case. Okay.
Look,
So
I think it should mention something in this. I mean, no one, it's totally unacceptable to have a system that I can systematically dial through every US phone number
got it,
and
yeah.
pull out all the names
got
away,
it.
right? But I was going to say, on the other hand, I mean, in the forward direction, whether your caller ID is included or not is a choice you have on the phone system, and your telco, does what you want, and you can even control it on a per call basis, right?
Yeah.
I don't really see why any of that would be different in the reverse direction. It's even going to be more true. An iMessage, if I get an iMessage from a new person, it asks me, like, do you want to share your photo with this person? I click yes or no the first time, and then that's it. And it's not frustrating. So I think there's really good models for how to deal with the user preferences in this case, and they're well understood, and we're already using them every day. And that, the draft mentions, like, it allows all of those models to work, do what you want to do, is like all that's needed. I don't think that's a big deal here. Yeah.
I'm willing to take as an action item. Let's mention, at least in the CDC case, that it's important that this be opt-in, and that policies exist to do that. I don't know what normatively we can say about that, but in the privacy considerations section, maybe we can add a thing that, please let the minutes reflect that we shall add to the privacy considerations certain statements about the interaction of RCD with connected identity for the C2C use case. Okay, so let me take another spin then on this. It's post-working, that's the last call. Let me take another spin, and then provided we do this and everyone's cool, we'll ship out.
We've got 3 people in queue still.
Oh, sorry. Pierce, you're back.
Yeah, I think Colin kind of hit what I was going to say, but when we talk about session border controllers and the service provider getting in the middle, and it's their authentication server, their verification server that's doing the work. I think I remember John Peterson saying at one point at a SIPNOT conference that we should expect at some point maybe the mobile phone would be capable of creating a passport or reading a passport, verifying it. And there's already, digital identity examples, especially in Europe, but I think the state of Utah, ironically, kind of led the way in creating a digital driver's license. So I think that we should be thinking about connected identity really being about connecting identities end to end, and not necessarily, I don't know, I just don't feel like we should be thinking about how to make sure that the service provider is doing anything. I think if a service provider is providing a service for connected identity, that's nice, but all I want them to do is deliver my passport. Thank you.
I mean, so when we start getting into the STIR MLS discussion, we're going to talk a little bit more about what kinds of credentials might end up actually being in end user devices. I think this is going to correlate strongly with places where we need keying material for encryption to reside on those end user devices, and that to somehow be linked to the STIR layer. And we're going to talk about a couple of different ways we might try to do that. But I mean, honestly, I think it should work out of the box with shaken certs as is, in the sense of this. If somebody is good enough to attest my identity with their AS when I am placing a call to someone, I believe they are also probably in a position to attest my identity in a response context as well. And so, yes, at the end of the day, I would love to get this down to individual TN certs that are, strongly coupled and under the control of end users. This is an incremental and evolutionary process, as you're well aware of, Pierce. So, please advocate for that in the places where people hate these ideas, like, Addis. Convince those people, and then we'll do it. How's that? Jonathan?
Having not read the draft, and I apologize for that, but the thing that Cullen mentioned about, getting the pop-up, do you want to send your identity to this person? Or that makes me wonder, is it possible to send this only mid-call? Basically, you talk to the person for a bit and say, yeah, okay, I trust them. I'll let them know that I'm really me. Or does this only happen at the initial beginning?
It works with mid-dialogue or dialogue updating requests.
And and is there notice that, implementation should pay attention to that if it only pops up
Well, I mean, I hadn't really considered this particular use case as a crucial one for this up until right now, of like when I want to share my contact book information with someone else and using RCD as a surrogate for that. And the way this works in the Apple ecosystem today, I just got one of these yesterday. I was in the middle of texting with somebody and I got the pop-up. It's like they are pushing new, contact info, picture and name stuff. Would you like to accept it or not? And I was like, sure. So like, I mean, I suspect there are going to be a whole bunch of adjacent systems where from a policy perspective, that stuff gets managed. Whether that actually is conveyed with RCD or not, if RCD is the new contact book populating mechanism of, the 2020s, I have no idea.
Yeah, and I mean, I just, maybe point out to people that you may only get this in mid-dialogue and pay attention to it if you do.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think we're good putting stuff in privacy considerations, and maybe we should separate the mechanism from the user facing part of it.
Because the UI aspect of that is completely out of our scope. Yeah.
And as long as we can do it at the beginning, do it mid, like I think we have some flexibility there to figure out what the policy should be.
Yeah, that's good. Okay, so I think I've got marching orders. We'll spin one more of these and everybody check it out. Cool. Next, adventure, my favorite.
Also, real quick reminder, even though we have the queuing tool, please state your name when you go to the microphone. There may be people who are just hearing the stream or listening later or looking at the transcript.
The recording will help.
Yeah, Jonathan Lennox. Just, I guess when you click the playback the session, it actually does not show the cue in the playback. So yes, Jonathan Lennox, and I was Jonathan Lennox last time also, which I didn't say.
Well, in that case, let me say again, I am once again John Peterson, standing at the front here, talking about way too many choices we have to make. Next slide, please. Okay, for those of you who do not spend their entire life worrying about STIR, what are we talking about here? Obviously, we all know who work with PKI that certificates expire. There are freshness issues for this. There are certificate revocations, lots of similar problems. There's been a ton of work done, especially around the web ecosystem and various similar PKIs into how you do that. And we want this for STIR. And obviously, like every STIR certificate we ship in the US, it has OCSP in it that you could use to validate these things in real time and make sure that this cert has not expired. The Shaken ecosystem publishes CRLs that are centralized. They aggregate these from like all the CAs that issue Shaken certs. And, we do have some unique challenges in this. And it's because the kinds of certs we defined in RFC 8226, they contain this new attribute called the TN off list. It's not something you would usually have in like an X509 web cert. And what that contains is a list of service provider codes and or telephone numbers, which are considered to be within the scope of authority of the certificate in question. Why does this raise freshness issues? Well, because those things can be kind of dynamic. And at any given moment, whether a certain telephone number is under the purview of a given carrier who had been issued a Shaken cert, something we got to solve for. And it's not just number portability, it's acquisitions, it's, and some people, especially certain CPaaS providers, they have extremely dynamic number ranges that they potentially interact with. And we want to find a way that we can get certificates, validate their freshness for a particular telephone number from which a call is being placed. In other words, the relying party, the verification service is receiving a call. We want to solve the problem of at the moment they received it, can they figure out if a particular telephone number is in the scope of authority for the cert that signed it? That's the job. Next slide. Yeah, so Jack from Metaswitch, now Facebook, he did a great summary of this in a very lengthy email a few months ago. Actually, even before the last IETF, I used exactly this slide, I think, at the last IETF to explain what our issue is. And this is such a problem we encounter all the time at the IETF. There's a bunch of different potential approaches. They all have almost entirely identical properties if you squint at them right. And this is where it's always very hard for us to make a decision about what to proceed and go forward with. Way back when we did RFC 8226, we defined a way that you could, instead of having a telephone number list actually baked into the cert itself, instead have a URL in the AI field that you can point to where you can go download the list of like all the numbers that this certificate currently has authority for. Problem is that can be big. Another problem with that is some people don't really want to reveal like every telephone number that they control to everyone else. And so we have a couple of hard edges around that. We've looked at an OCSP extension, and this OCSP extension does something very specific, which it lets you ask the question, not only is the certificate still fresh, but is this particular telephone number? And you just plug in like one number within the scope of authority of the cert, right? And like that takes care of a lot of the concerns about you have to reveal all the numbers associated with it. Instead, just on a onesie-twosie basis, as a relying party, I received a call, I'm trying to verify it. Is this number in scope? Now, there are also ways to do that where you don't have to do a dip, where instead we could staple. And stapling is very common in web applications using TLS and so on. And we defined in this draft Peterson STIR OCSP staple a new staple element of the passport that effectively contains what that OCSP response would have been, so that you pay the cost for acquiring that on the sending side, the calling side, the authentication server side, rather than requiring the verification server to do an RTT, right, at the end of it. So that's an optimization on this. But then there's a completely radically different, entirely different way of doing this, which is why bother having these long-lived certs that you then have to do all this OCSP stuff for and CRLs and whatever else, when we could just issue short-lived certs. This cert only attests, say, a particular telephone number. It maybe only exists for an hour. Maybe it only exists for the scope of this call. This cert will only live for a minute, and I get it dynamically generated, like at the authentication service at the time I'm putting this forward. And that property, it actually works a lot at the end of the day if you squint your eyes like OCSP with stapling. Because basically what you do is you go to your certificate of authority, you get this cert, much the same way you would go to them and get the staple. And again, this is what makes these things so hard. It's like they're so similar, choosing between them is super difficult. I'm sorry, I did just update the short-lived document today, so that's no longer expired, or yesterday, whenever I did it. And finally, we have this idea of doing short-lived certs with stapling. Now, we're not literally going to staple. What we're going to do is send the cert as a literal in the X5C in the JOT header of the passport. This makes the passport big, right? We'll put the whole cert chain in it, but I mean, effectively, what we're trying to avoid here is, again, incurring that RTT on the verification service side. Instead, we'll spend that RTT on the AS side to get this short-lived cert. Since I've already got it, why not just stick it in the passport and ship that? So these are the 50,000 options that we have for this. And we've got a bunch of documents that are defining this stuff. Next slide, please. Eric, if you want to intervene on that. Was that crazy, the last one?
I guess I don't understand quite the difference in the last two. So maybe you could try to flesh that out a little more.
So, I mean, short-lived without stapling would be, I just send an X5U. And so the verification service, the relying party, actually has to go do the URL fetch to get the short-lived cert. That's the way STIR Shaken ordinarily works. We don't ship the cert typically, in the passport or in the SIP request or anything else. We just make the terminating side go do a URL dep. So we're saying, let's short circuit that and just as a DER encoded base64 literal, put the cert or its entire cert chain, right, literally into the header of the passport. That's what the last option is.
I see. But you don't have, that's not what you do with the current situation.
It's not. And everybody would really need to change everything we do about authentication and verification services to support X5C having huge DER encoded stuff that's in them.
Is there any reason to believe that doing the OCSP retrieval is somehow slower than doing the X5U dereference?
So the argument is, and you tell me how plausible you think this is, especially if those staples can live for a somewhat substantial amount of time. If the AS has to do that and then can reuse it, maybe, right, for more than one call. And for large call centers, they're placing a ton of calls, right? Where you just want to staple, I'm playing 10,000 calls from this number out in the next, so can that So you only pay that cost once on the AES side. All the diverse places that the calls terminate in the VS side won't have to do that RTT. So that's the argument. It's more efficient.
I think maybe you answered a question different than I was asking, or I didn't understand you. So it seems like at a very, very high level, there are like there's like a high level cut, which is, does the caller provide all the information you would need in order to validate the call in the block, or does it not?
Yeah.
And if it does not, then the verifier has to go retrieve some stuff, right?
Yes.
And so in sort of like in the sort of not without stapling designs, the verifier has to retrieve some stuff, right? And then in the OCSP without stapling design, he's going and does, I guess, an OCSP fetch. And in the shortly source without stapling, he goes and does like, give me this static document. But those seem like extraordinarily similar, with the only difference being one goes to like the CA and one goes perhaps to the call service, right? Now, is there any reason to believe those are different?
Not really.
As I thought, okay.
Because so we have this concept in Shaken of a CR, certificate repository, which is technically can be decoupled from the CA.
Yeah.
Right. And those can be CDN'd out, and
Right.
might be slightly cheaper, but the difference is minuscule.
Yeah. So I guess.
But they're bigger.
Sure.
Oh, well, let's be clear. OCSP is in every Shaken cert that we issue.
Right. So
yes.
So I guess, we
issue a lot of Shaken.
The second question I have is like, do we understand what the desired lifetime of these objects is? Because like it is, if the desired lifetime is like a week, like a web PKI cert, then like that has very different cache dynamics. Because I imagine if you're a verifier, you're actually receiving quite a few calls, perhaps with the same number over and over again, especially if it's like, if like Jonathan, it's like 5 nines calling you, right? And so that would be, that cache, that would be very helpful, right? Yeah. Whereas if they have like a millisecond, then, or only for one call, then there's like no cache value on the verifier, right?
Yeah. And the documents do talk a lot about that trade-off of caching in this as well. But I mean, I think the argument is, if you do a short-lived without stapling, then yes, you are going to have to do those fetches all the time. You can't cache the certs. But if you're just shipping, right, the short-lived in the X5C, then you have it, and its entire cert chain with it, and you can validate it, right?
Agreed, right.
So caching doesn't matter is the argument in that case, right? Do you agree with that?
Well, no, I don't necessarily think so, because caching, caching matters on the calling side, because they don't, if they're long, they don't have to retrieve them. So
there's no free lunch. I get that.
Yeah. I mean, if it's only good for one call, right? Then you're going to like do it. Then it's in the inline for the calling point, right? I just don't really understand enough about the dynamics of like the system. I guess I did not realize. So just like hop to it. I didn't realize like in the current situation that you were like always making a fetch up during the call. Are people sad about that?
Well, today you cache a lot, right?
Okay, yeah.
That's the point.
You cache the S5U, right?
The Jonathan cert lasts forever, right? Well, not forever, but
yeah.
The cert lasts a long time. And so because you cache that, but the point is there is no TN validation component to that.
Yeah.
Like there's no way to say, you're just trusting Jonathan to be Jonathan. He's going to be honest about these things. And of course, 5.9 would never issue a telephone call from a calling party number that they were not 100% sure like was being used legitimately.
At least 90%. So
there's a stochastic differential equation they use to determine that this probability flow suggests it's
right. So okay, right. So I think that's so you're saying that's very cacheable, right? So I guess like there's been quite a bit of work on like trying to like effectively like commit and then unpack this kind of stuff that it would not be OCSP. I mean, so you're saying people don't do OCSP checks now? Like they just basically assume the certs are valid and then don't bother OCSP check them?
Yeah, I mean, like in Chrome, you put it's similar to
it's got a super long lifetime.
There's a list of trusted CAs and certs, and
it's
pushed.
Right. So I guess like and I actually see Dennis in the back here, so he may have some thoughts about this. But like I wonder, this is so like the question of is this still valid for this particular phone number is like a different question from the question of is this credential still valid?
Yeah,
that's right. And I wonder if we could cook up some way to like basically, and do I have one? No, but I wonder if we could cook up some like non-OCSP way to basically, progressively release like, okay, you're now valid for this phone number, at this time frame, Merkle trees, hash commitments, blah, 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 right? And there used to be some IPR in this, I think. McCallie had some on revocation via, that may no longer be valid. But I just wonder if there's some way to cook that. Could they have entirely different that would have better properties than either of these options?
But the difference is with number portability, it's constantly changing.
No, I get that, right? But I hesitate to even bother to sketch this in the microphone, right?
What I hear you saying is you're going to add more to this list.
Yeah. But my dumb version of this is there's effectively it's effectively like a Merkle hash tree of one for each, in this Merkle hash root in the cert, with a leaf with a sub node, a child node for each day, and then there's a tree for each phone number, and these are commitments. And then what happens is that essentially you go and before you make the call, you go and you say, give me the unwound commitment for this exact phone number, and that is just like a hash path plus a hash. That may be much smaller than any of this garbage. And
and that's something we just stick in the passport, in a new field that would
exactly. Because that could, again, I'm really totally spitballing, but I just wonder, I guess why don't I sit down? I should
we've got a few others in queue, so let's discuss. But definitely interested in your thought, because again, we're just sitting here on this stack of the stuff now, saying, are we going to do all of this, some of this, or because we can't figure out what's better?
Right. So I've forgotten who I am this morning. I think I'm fluffy still, Cullen Jennings, and on all of these. Obviously, doing 10 different options here is not a win. And I definitely yeah, exactly. I know we can't decide. Definitely live towards, I want to go towards the simplicity thing. And I think the question about OCSP and stuff, and you sort of saw half of that where somebody says nobody does it. Somebody says, oh, no, we put it in every cert. Writing it's easy. The question is what happens to calls when the OCSP server is down, right? And my understanding is they all go through fine. And I think we've seen attacks that sort of leverage that. Now, I'm not sure that's true. That's only one anecdotal case got dragged into.
Oh, but it would be a policy decision to give it a green check mark or not if OCSP is unavailable, right? And the defensive posture would be you don't give it a green check mark then.
Yeah, but what do people do in real, right?
Well, again, if OCSP failed at RVS, we would not give it a green check mark. We'd let the call go through. But it just wouldn't get it in the green check mark.
Ben, jumping the queue here real quick to respond to that. I'm pretty sure, at least in the general service provider approach to this, you do not fail calls because of STIR failures. Yeah. You just don't. You just don't verify.
Don't get a check mark, right? Okay. That's as I was going to say is. A system that just fails unsafe is what you've got in that case, right? So it's not. No one checks the fucking check mark. Sorry.
I'll put it this way.
Anyway, what I was going to get to is that might be part of our design. That might be one of the things we want to think about is that outcome.
So just to be clear about what it means not to get a green check mark, that also means no RCD. So in other words, we won't show you the logo. We won't if
so that is fine for the use cases of this is Bank of America. Bank of America never calls me. They're calling one time because of a fraud thing, like they called me once 3 years ago. Whatever. Sure, works in that case, but it does not at all deal very well with the case of I'm routinely getting a phone call from someone, and this time it was man in the middle, and I'd sort of like to know that. Right, which is also a fairly common case we're trying to do here.
You won't have the assurance, and you just have to make your own judgment in that case. Especially if you're used to getting the assurance from them, and this is something, again, we encourage people to build into the UX of all this, right? Is if I'm used to getting assurance from Fidelity Investment and they call me and I get a call from Fidelity and that assurance is missing, I should treat this call with caution.
Okay.
Jonathan Lennox. So maybe you don't care about this given the current architecture, but if you ever do want to think about actually doing the verification on the end devices, mobile phones are notoriously have their clocks wrong because people are cheating at Candy Crush. So
Yeah.
that might affect anything that's short, where it's based on short-lived times. So that might be,
Yeah, it would just look like an expiry fail. Yeah.
yeah.
Duly noted. I'm not sure I can actually describe that in the draft, but yes, Jonathan.
Jonathan Rosenberg. I think we just learned that Jonathan Lennox plays a lot of Candy Crush and
We learned he
cheats.
cheats at Candy Crush. Is what we
Cheats
just
at-
learned.
Yeah. Asking for a friend, says Jonathan
Yeah,
Lennox.
yeah.
Okay, so two comments. One, just to respond to what Cullen said, Cullen Jennings. So we're a contact center, and so there's a very interesting inbound case where one of the things, if you've all contacted a contact center, they want to verify who you are. Those verification procedures vary tremendously based on use cases. For us, it's super interesting to know, okay, there was a STIR certificate and it didn't pass, we'll ask more, the agent should ask more questions.
Yes, yes.
If it did, maybe they ask less questions. So there are cases like that where there's a lot of stuff that can happen based on it if we consider those cases. Secondly, I want to come back to what Ecker was saying, which is that I feel like we're sort of treating this like an OCSP problem or a certificate problem, but it's nothing to do with that at all. The reality is that we're talking about phone number lists, and those phone number lists could be in the certificate, but they're mostly not in the certificates. In fact, to my knowledge today, they're never in the certificates. The reality is they're a pointer to something that is outside the certificate, not verified by the certificate, has nothing to do with the certificate, and might not, although I know it is in your case, might not even be provided by the CA. So I wonder if what we're talking about here is, in essence, a protocol that allows the receiving AS to interrogate, hey, I've been told that this URL here or whatever, this is a list of phone numbers. I wonder if this phone number I just got is in that list, and we've only mistaken that as an OCSP problem because there could be a case where it's in the cert, but it's mostly not going to be in the cert. So should we just, and Ecker was starting to sketch out protocols by which you can push information that allows you to make a verified or not check without even leaking information. There's all kinds of interesting stuff.
So why am I obsessed with coupling these things? Let me explain this.
With coupling those things. Okay, yes, please. Yeah.
Well, it's for one simple reason. It's that I want to make sure that the scope of authority so remember, there's a whole, like in Shaken, a whole ecosystem by which you go to someone to prove you're the carrier that you say you are, and that results in your ability to get a cert. I want a linkability between that check that makes sure you're AT&T and the set of number ranges associated with AT&T. There are any number of third-party oracles that will tell you, this is what I think the set of numbers associated with AT&T
I'm not talking about
is.
that. Okay, but my point, even for, let's take Neustar case. It would not surprise me if the piece of software that runs OCSP is not the same piece of software that will have access to the database of numbers that you want to verify is this number as part of this list of users. Like even within the same,
it's a different microservice. That's
well, I mean, it could be just these are my point is these are different things, and even if they're often run by the same provider, that doesn't mean you should couple them at the protocol level. Which, if you use OCSP, you are. So I'm sort of advocating for like none of the above as something at least worth exploring.
Yeah, I mean, again, but let's go back to the fundamentals. So, and I gave this example to you before the meeting started. Neustar owns some telephone numbers that it's had for 20 years that are under 571-434, good Northern Virginia numbers, right? I can make a cert that bakes those, because those numbers just don't change, that it would appear by value in the cert, right? And what is the process that we imagine the CA goes through to ascertain that happens? What all of this is trying to preserve is precisely that whatever the process is in the Shaken or more broadly, post-Shaken infrastructure we're imagining for telephone numbers, that the vetting entities that are determining that, this telephone number range belongs to the person to whom the cert is issued, right? That binding is what is exposed to relying parties. And, again, I'm very hesitant to look at this as a decouplable problem where like there's a cert, it's got a service provider code in it, or it's got like a URL in it or something, right? And like, but I'm just going to use some completely different set of data to ascertain whether or not I think this telephone number is in the scope of authority of that cert. If the entities that are not doing the vetting of those certs and determining, okay, here's your cert for 5.9, here's the things that it should be good for, are not the same entities that are maintaining that list, we have a problem. And like, People, there are a million exploits. There's a huge threat surface for what that would look like. And so I just want to make sure we don't discard that property as we start looking at alternatives to this, because all these things fall out from that fundamental fact that, you could just bake the numbers into the cert itself, because the CIA did whatever vetting the CIA is supposed to do to determine, okay, New Star has these like 571-434 numbers, and it's just a couple thousand blocks. I'm just going to bake it into the cert. All this is just, what can we do if it's more complicated that still preserves that property? You don't seem convinced, so feel free to, yeah.
Chris went. So I don't disagree that number lists are an important use case, but for me, it's more than that. It's RCD and all this other stuff we want to do, and we want to. And I guess my other point is
amplify that a little bit though, just because I don't think people understand what.
Well, just
what's in the certificate that helps RCD. So there's a set of things in
right,
certs
exactly.
as well that constrain what can go in RCD. And so it kind of
that ties it not just to the telephone number,
Yes.
but to the RCD content and other things like that. So we want to make sure that that is well vetted, that is up to date, that is, revoked when it's wrong and or no longer with the right to use party that's associated with that information. The other point I want to make is maybe I like short-lived certs with stapling. I like using X5C because it's more of a, so if we go beyond 8224 and we just think about 8225, so passports as JWTs themselves, as self-contained objects, like to me, that makes sense more from a futuristic point of view, that we're not tying it to protocols and other things that other clients may not have implemented or may not have more readily implemented, that it is, I'm just getting everything in this one object, I can validate it and I'm good.
Next in queue is, I can't see from here.
It's Ben pretending to be from the floor again. Two things really, one as a participant and one as a chair. The participant side, when we've asked about who's really doing OCSP, we do know that Addis has a update to their delegate certificate document that is on hold because they have assumed the OSP is an option and they're waiting for us to be stable to publish it. So I think it's just an option there. So I don't know who's actually planning on implementing. Maybe Chris knows better than I do.
Well, my personal opinion is that we shouldn't use that as I think we should figure out what the right thing to do is.
I'm not saying that's a forcing function. I'm just pointing out when people asked that question earlier.
Right.
And then as a chair, I think I would like to have come out of this conversation with a clear understanding about whether or not we're going to finish certificates OCSP, which is pretty much, thought it was pretty much done.
Yeah, hopefully Sean will come up in a second and talk a little bit about what we just fixed. I guess Russ pitched in on that as well. I mean, yeah, so could you just go ahead a slide? And I know there's more in queue, but just go ahead a slide real quick. Keep going. We already talked about that. Get to the one that's, go beyond this too. We already talked about all this. And this is a discussion, we're already having it. All right, like, this is my main question, right, is what the hell are we gonna do? And like, my proposal has been that, first of all, we're gonna adopt short-lived because I do think we get it basically for free, right? Now, there's a lot of questions about how people get these short-lived certs and whether the Acme ecosystem is actually going to be dynamic enough for people to be able to use these. My current version does downplay Acme a bit and talks a bit more of just like, hey, however it is, you've got some web interface or whatever it is that you're using to get like short-lived certs, that's great. We want to judge you on that. And to advance OCSP is the baseline. But like, what this reflects from me is, I think getting these tools out there into the community, I honestly think they could they accomplish the same things, and I can imagine them being useful in different cases, and I can imagine them coexisting and it not being a problem for these things to like all be out there, because short-lived search really isn't that different from just using certs, right? And so, an OCSP really isn't that different from the OCSP that we've done for everything forever. So like, that has been my pitch. And if there is a third approach that Ecker is going to pull out of his massive brain, and then we're going to have another way to do this, that might convince me that we should do less than this. But this is my current plan. Simon, please opine on any of this.
Just wanted to check on a couple of points. Firstly, you've been talking about certificates with TN auth lists and all the OCSP work. Presumably that does only apply to delegate certificates for all of this. We're not talking about anything that would affect service provider level certificates.
Probably not, yeah.
Cool. And secondly, similarly on the RCD front, I assume therefore this only affects RCD certificates and not, or passports rather, and not RCD embedded in shaken passports.
You're a little quiet. Could you?
Oh,
speak a
sorry.
little louder? I didn't quite catch that.
I will just try talking louder.
Thanks.
I just wanted to check that the RCD we're talking about here is just RCD passports and not RCD embedded in shaken passports. Like a terminating service provider wouldn't have any reason to receive a shaken with RCD contained in it and say, oh, well, there's no OCSP for this, therefore I'm going to drop it. Because
is there a material difference?
Related.
It sounds to me like you think there's a material difference between those two cases. If so, what is it for the purposes of OCSP?
So I think most thing I'm looking at this from is this a mandatory extension that for RCD to work, or is this an optional extension that gives additional security if enabled?
I think he's talking about fate sharing.
Yeah.
Your TN verification.
I don't think any of this needs to be mandatory. No.
Okay. Thanks.
I think
that's
these
all
are tools and they can be helpful. And like, Chris, do you have a different view of that, or what's next in queue? Sorry, is it you?
Sure, man. Chris went. I think that's a little bit of a controversial subject because I think the current sort of industry discussion around putting RCD and shaken doesn't have integrity and doesn't follow the specs in my perspective, but that's a different discussion.
Yeah, we unfortunately can't make people listen to us. We can just design good tech and hopefully people will come around. Jonathan, you next?
Jonathan Rosenberg. So I do have a worry about advancing the OCSP that I'd like to discuss. And it gets back to the privacy issue that's discussed in the draft. And specifically that, the extension being proposed, if implemented, absolutely will cause the verification service to have information about calling patterns that it didn't have before. Namely, it will know that a particular phone number called a particular terminating provider on a call-by-call basis, and that's not something
which stapling gets around.
Which I understand that stapling gets around, but that means this draft by itself, without stapling or some other mechanism, introduces a significant privacy consideration. So
is that not noted in the draft today?
It's noted, but like it just, to me, it's
it's not worth doing this if we don't staple. Is that your perspective?
That's the item I'd like to discuss, and it gets back to like, well, if you didn't think about this and I'm not going to die on this hill, but I think it requires discussion, right? If you didn't think about this as an OCSP issue at all, and rather just was trying to solve a problem, which is how do I, as a verification service, know that the phone number here is associated with this certificate? If that's a problem you're trying to solve, you could certainly design protocols that have the privacy properties you desire. by pushing, hash tables or Merkle trees or Bloom filters. I've been sitting here thinking about how you do it that has really nice properties you could never do with OCSP or OCSP stapling because it requires something different. So that would sort of be like, we're trying to shove something as a little bit of a square peg in a round hole that's whose origins are that we're trying to jam a highly dynamic set of phone numbers generally into this thing. And that gets back to something you said before, which is hey, you thought these are coupled because the certification authority, they're the ones who are verifying the ownership of the number before issuing the certificate, and that's an important property, to which I agree. But that doesn't mean you can't obtain the security by reference rather than by value. What I mean by that is if you can imagine that the certificate, the T and auth list reference, basically is a delegation of trust. It says, I, the authorization service, hereby do declare that this guy over here, who may even be a different company, I've pushed everything to them. They're authoritative, right? It doesn't have to be the same entity that issues a certificate in order to have the trust required to use that service to verify that there is this binding.
No, I mean, broadly, I agree. And again, a lot of this comes down to an Ecker, maybe, if you're fleshing this out as we're sitting here, like if whatever the Merkle tree is actually ultimately signed by an entity that we can link in some way to then it'll be fine from a security perspective. I agree. Yeah, if you can spit it, you can spit out the way that looks and it works that way, I think it's fine. Chris.
So Chris went, I have a stronger opinion that we should either do stapling with OCSP or include the cert with H5C because of the caching issues. I'd rather see that on the authentication service side because that generally has all that information fairly close to it, and probably if there's any delay, I would rather see it on before the calls actually
I really
placed.
have a hard time seeing why we would not advance the short-lived with my X5C hack in it. Because it seems too useful. It's too easy. It doesn't require any complicated stuff, right? It's a cert. You get it with the passport and it's like valid.
Are you agreeing with
just
me?
trust it. What's that?
You're agreeing with me?
I am saying at least of these options here in this proposal, we can decide we're going to trash OCSP entirely in favor of something that Ecker is about to show us. But I have a hard time seeing why we would ever not want to specify the short-lived thing. More or less as given, right?
Okay, yeah, that's fair. But my point was more that I think sending the staple or the cert in the call is the right thing to do, and not making the verification service query OCSP or go to some certificate repository is a better path forward.
Again, the OCSP stapling draft basically just adds a new passport-like element that is staple. And it's, again, just literally what the staple would have been if, we're doing this TLS style. So that has always been the plan. Anybody else in queue?
I am.
Ben
Campbell. On that step, kind of questioning Chris's perspective there. I know you say you don't want to force the use of OSP by the VS. Does that mean you don't want to publish the document that allows it? Or, clarify where, I guess we need to come out of this meeting kind of knowing what our action items are.
I don't want to block it from a mechanism point of view. I'm maybe expressing what I'd like to see the industry adopt. I don't know if that means something different, but I think we've been going down this road sort of progressively, and we're laid out all these different options, and I think we've gotten to the point where we, at least from my perspective, see some actually reasonable options that the industry might actually adopt. So maybe I'm trying to do a shortcut there, but I'm not going to push against necessarily adopting the document either.
I don't know, Sean and Russ, if you want to talk at all to the OCSP approach. I mean, I know you guys just patched this up. Sean, why don't you speak to it a bit? So you can say kind of what we've done, how we is what we're doing weird? here, or is
No,
this like?
hey, Sean Turner. So it's not weird, but it is new. I've got no dog in this fight. If this working group is like, let's do something else and this one needs to die, I got other things to do. So I am concerned to try to make sure how it ties into the cert and to the revocation part. And so that's really was one of the natural things. Like we did certs, like that. I got started in this whole thing was because John's like, what do you know about certs? I'm like, just a little bit. So we worked on that, put an extension in there. Is like, what are we going to do this? I'm like, we could use OCSP because it's in the same stack of stuff, right? Like your CAs kind of do all these things and it all kind of fits together. And if we're going to do something new, I just have to figure out how we're going to put it in and how it all kind of hangs together can all be worked. And then it depends on the architecture, right? Because you're right, you have to look at it and figure out where the revocation information is going to come from and what you're leaking. Because we were very early on, John was like, what does this mean? I'm like, well, we're giving up a phone number because it does go in the response of the one. Could you put a hash in there instead of a thing? Maybe, but it's like, that's where you're starting to get, then you're starting to get a little like kind of weird, right? It's kind of like, all right, well, whatever. So yeah, but I think you'd have to look at it and like look at the architecture that's actually out there and being used and see what works. So yeah, like again, this is not a hill on which I'm willing to die.
I just need this off my plate, man, because I've been going to a lot of meetings showing basically these.
John's
going to
smack me after this meeting. I can.
What
tell.
am I supposed to do? Just somebody tell me what to do, and we'll do it.
I accidentally took Jonathan out of queue, but I assume he's really still in queue.
I was still in queue. Jonathan Rosenberg. So one thing that advances documents without like waiting for Ecker's, thing to nuke OCSP is, and would satisfy my request, is just couple the stapling with the baseline.
Yeah.
Meaning like the combine the two documents and the document says, you should not use this without stapling. And that would address the concern
and
I
should
raised.
not all satisfy you?
Yeah, I mean,
okay.
People are going to do what they're going to do no matter what I say. So, the best we can do is write recommendations in a document.
I can do that.
Pierce.
Pierce.
Hi, this is Pierce Gorman. Anyway, does anybody know of any production use of delegate certificates? I'd be somewhat surprised because, well, the RCD spec's not done, so it'd be prior to RCD, and unless something significant changes in version 1.4 of the governance authority certificate policy, I think that the subordinate certification authorities, the right to be a subordinate certification authority, get intermediate certificates and issue end entity certificates based on the fact that you're a service provider or responsible organization is not going to be the sort of thing that causes a lot of trust with terminating service providers. I think that so the discussion on OCSP or stapling for something that I suspect may not get used. That's my comment. I wrote something similar to Jack's excellent email that actually tried helpfully to advance the discussion here. I put something at the bottom. I don't remember what I decided I liked best. I think it was stapling. And maybe I could say here, if stapling sounds good to folks, then okay. But the only comment I'll make there is you're bloating an already bloated SIP invite. And I was amused earlier at the comment or the discussion on mutual authentication, thinking about up to 4 passports attached to a SIP invite. Okay, make it 5. I don't know. Anyway, that's it. It was a rant. I don't know if that was helpful at all. I'll be quiet now.
It's helpful at all. I mean, I think so. Yes, there are cases in which delegate certs are being used in production today, although perhaps not ones that entirely conform with the way that ATIS perceives this. But like the short answer is most of those are being consumed at the OSP, right? And then the OSP is re-signing. And whether the original identity headers continue to be forwarded along is like kind of up to the conscience of the individual churchgoer. But like, so I wouldn't say that there is a null use case for this. But yeah, I hear you. And I don't know. I mean, again, if it were me, I would just push this stuff out. I'm willing to accept Jonathan's suggestion that we actually just take the stuff that's in the stapling draft, the definition of this staple field, push that in at should not use OCSP without staple in level. Like I can do that.
Does anyone else use OCSP more than the other?
Yeah, that's reasonable to progress the draft.
And like maybe some people use, this is the point. I not only are these so hard to choose between, I don't actually feel like they solve an overlapping, Venn diagram of cases, but there are some things it's better to do with OCSP stapling, some things it's better to do with short-lived. Like I think they're both useful, and I'm sure whatever Ecker is about to.
I'm not making a comment short-lived.
Okay.
Yeah, it wouldn't be weird to put the two of these together. I mean, it's a new thing. It's a new.
We talked about
yeah,
it.
and like
separate.
right. Like again, it could work. Again, this is a vanity contest, right?
Yeah.
Just here are all the ways we've explored them all, and we're coming up with some new ones. And
okay.
Does anyone object to the action of combining the OSP and the stapling drafts and moving it forward that way?
And also, can we please adopt the short-lived draft? It's like draft Peterson, 97 at this point. Like, we adopt it. Yeah.
Okay.
So those two asks.
For this is a sense of the room. Both of them really sense of the room. Does anyone object to us doing a call for adoption shortly on the mailing list? Does anyone think that's the wrong thing to do?
Of short-lived, you mean?
Of short-lived. Really, that's what we do in the room. I mean, we're taking a sense of the room. Would anyone here object would anyone say no when we make that consensus call?
I'm not sure when this crap started at the IETF, but you are allowed to ask for consensus from the room. Consensus is made by the information you get from the room, the list, and the other place. You can't only do it from the room, okay? So it's fine for you to ask, is there consensus to do, kick Fluffy out of the room or whatever? It's all good. But
Is there consensus to kick Fluffy out of the room? Okay. So we'll ask in the room. The first question, we already asked the first question. Does anyone object? I think we're fine there. Does anyone in this room object to adopting short-lived? Okay, so I'll take that as consensus of the room. We will confirm that consensus on the mailing list.
Great. Hey, that's.
So just for the notes, the action is to combine stapling into the OSP baseline with a should.
Yes, you should not use this without stapling. I can do that. Okay. We're done with this, I think.
Okay. So technically that puts us to any other business, but we have other business, so we'll switch to that.
Finally, a new speaker will come up to talk to you about something else. I'm just kidding. It's all me.
Get a new hat.
Yeah, I've got a hat. Where's my hat?
Of course you have a hat.
It's somebody completely different.
Hello, I am Pon Jeterson, and I'm here today to talk about potential new business, new direction. Wow, new stuff we need to do. Next slide. Why am I talking about this? As some of you may be aware, if you were here for the beginning of this meeting, we have a STIR for messaging draft. Very exciting. Apparently, Murray pushed the button, and that is now on its way to become an RFC. Long time in the making, but it's basically like a very high level framework. If you look at the STIR for messaging draft, what it says is, okay, interactions with applications like RCS, where you're basically just starting up message sessions, everything we do normally for STIR for calls should just work. And then it has a little thing that says, oh, and in addition, if you have like a one-off message that's in, using the old STIR message method, which is so widely used in the world today, but also indeed things potentially like SMPP or just normal ways of doing SMS, as Chris was just pointing out a few minutes ago. RFC 8225 is not SIP specific. None of this stuff is. And there are like all kinds of alternative ways that we could be working with passports and systems that don't look much like telephone calls. But like really the proximate trigger for me showing you this slide today, some of you may have heard, there's been some chatter about implementing message layer security, which also has a brand spanking new RFC number, into RCS, into a system that the GSMA and Google and several other people have been pushing for some time for kind of unified communications in the mobile network. And the integration of MLS into RCS raises some questions. Basically, what we said in the STIR messaging draft is, you know, if you're setting up sessions with like MSRP over TLS, which I guess was common in some of the earlier RCS specifications, here's how that would work. I'm interested now in what the interplay is between MLS specifically and setting up sessions where STIR would serve as a credential. And then when you start looking at this chocolate and peanut butter question of how you kind of get STIR to work together with MLS, there are a couple of moving pieces I think we'd want to decide between. I'm not sure how much 8225 there would be in this versus just pure 8226. In the sense of you're going to have a STIR certificate, and that STIR certificate is somehow going to be related to the credentialing systems that have been built into MLS. Now, if any of you caught Richard Barnes's talk at the beginning of the MLS session yesterday, they're looking at potential ways that multiple credentials could kind of be plugged into MLS, because MLS, like TLS itself, it's not really, you know, it's a layer below the applications that will invoke it, where concepts like identity, whatever the hell that means, as I learned at SAG yesterday, like, you know, where identity gets plugged into this. I think we all acknowledge, though, that a lot of messaging that happens in the world today is telephone number based for identifiers. And as a consequence, it would be great if we could figure out the right hooks to get, you know, the existing STIR credentials that have gone out to all these carriers who went to all this trouble to build these like massive PKIs that are attesting who these carriers are and what they have authority for, and to have those be able to plug into the credentialing systems above MLS. My understanding is there's kind of a way to point up to a credential from within MLS and say, this is like a credential that I'm associated with the public keying material I'm sharing in order to be able to participate in a room and so on. And of course, we also have a way within SIP itself that goes back to SIP Brandy, RFC 8860, I can't remember what SIP Brandy is now, but through the M key parameter to be able to have like a hash of the public keying material that's being used for like voice encryption for things like DTLS, SRTP, and build that into a passport itself. So if we did want some passport integration with it, that would be a way to do it. But ultimately, what we may be talking about more than anything else is just having STIR certs serve as credentials for, you know, attesting in MLS, this is an identity I should be able to claim, maybe one of several that, like, you know, kind of people can choose from in determining whether or not to trust me. And maybe there needs to be some further glue that's like, if you're using OpenID credentials or some similar thing down at that layer, is there some way to get the shaken certificate to like sign that, bless it, something? Because again, really what you get in MLS when you're pointing up to, oh, like I'm using this cert, well, it would be really great if there was like some way that, you know, you could validate that in fact they're pointing to a cert that they actually have some association with rather than anything else. And that this is a problem I think we need to solve. And I talked to Richard Barnes about this, and Richard has generously agreed to do some initial work on this with me to see if we can like float a draft here, see what that would look like. And I want to know if anybody thinks this is a terrible idea, because if so, I've got other things to do with my life. But I see Jonathan's already in queue and several other people are, so let us discuss in our remaining few minutes here.
Jonathan Rosenberg. I mean, I obviously think this is a great idea. I mean, I wrote a draft, this GLaDOS thing that was looking at a different dimension of phone numbers, just bring all kinds of interesting properties to the system. The more of a input as you build the draft,
yes,
to not overlook the hardest part of this problem, which has nothing to do with cryptography, and it's the organizational relationships of the entities that would end up using this thing. So we have three players here. We have the consumer who's sending the message. We have their provider, which is like WhatsApp or Facebook. And then we have the entity that today owns a certificate, which is a carrier for the phone number. And
JNSP, as we
right,
say.
yeah, exactly. And the relationship between the first two and that third is like today sort of non-existent, if not antagonistic. So that's the hard part to solve is how do you convince someone how do you convince the service providers to let someone else take advantage of these certificates and hand them out to consumers, which is eventually in the MLS context, that's how it has to go. Like I have to get a hold of a certificate so that I can sign or use it for MLS. And I think that's the hardest part of the problem. And if we ignore that, we're going to have another unimplementable draft.
Yeah, so let me say one thing about that, which is, when I was talking to Chris about this over lunch just the other day, I think there's one further piece of work that we need to do in ACME related to all of this. And it's something that I had a draft about this years and years ago, which is basically using ACME to create a token for proof of possession for telephone numbers that does precisely kind of GLaDOS like push, but is abstracted out from the rest of the GLaDOS thing. And I have a draft about this, and actually even warned Deb that I had like one more thing I want to do there, and it's that just for this purpose. So you're going to end up getting an authority token generated that says this proof of possession, had been conducted, and this person has his telephone number, which we could then plug both into GLaDOS and into this. But that is a separable piece of work. And if you'd like to work on that with us as well, please jump on board, Ben.
I mean, this is what I had in mind is like the next phase of GLaDOS is once you've externalized the mobile number verification to this independent party, like it can directly issue certificates for those phone numbers that demonstrate proof of possession to consumers and therefore bootstrap the identity for Mimi. This is certainly one of the things I had in mind when I wrote the draft.
My point is let's table that out of Mimi and everything else and let's do that as a pure ACME. Like this is what the service looks like. This is how we think this is going to conduct it. It's going to generate an authority token you can then take to a CA or to any other comparable entity and like get your cert.
So we've got
There's some modernism in that as well. Yes.
Hi, I'm Altanai from Cisco Meraki. Having worked on some of the Canal stuff and early adoption of STIR, I can see that there may be an issue where there could be a problem in the topological sort of things because a lot of people use direct inward dialing, like OTP kind of functionality to log into something. And now we are saying, okay, but if you receive 2 OTP, then you select one of these, like based on the certificate who issued this OTP. So how back we will go in authenticating the right origin?
Yeah, I mean, this is interesting in MLS because they are looking at these multiple credentialing systems, and at least one of them is looking at like OpenID and things that are related to like, and I'm also looking at how we could potentially try to link these credentials as well between things for Shaken and even like OpenID. And I've been talking to Christine a bit about that. So like, I think there are going to be ways to do that. But the key thing about the MLS interaction in particular is that you can have a plurality of credentialing systems, and really then becomes a question of, when you're connected to a particular room, if somebody trusts any one of them, they can get your identity through that, right? And so for those OTT services, if we're performing this proof of possession like GLaDOS style check, like there may be people that will trust that. And there may be other people though that want to trust something very different. Does that answer your question or your
kind of?
concern?
So we would later on in the draft, you would say trust all or trust either or trust few.
So currently
like
the way I understand the MLS draft on this is you can do it as you need to trust all with criticality. And this would be for cases where you have multiple layers of organization, precisely in the kinds of cases you're describing, where you kind of need everyone's buy-off. But there is also a model where you only have to trust one. As long as you have one overlapping trust anchor, you correct me if I'm wrong here, Sean, like if you have one overlapping like trust anchor with someone, then you can trust them on that. So I think it can work either way, and we would have the option of deciding for this which way we want it to work.
Okay.
Well, I mean, obviously, I think the only, love to see us do this. We need to do something like this, and we need to construct the business case and the business relationships for it. I think it's just the number of levels of indirection we need. I mean, do we need something like Let's Encrypt? And Richard Burns did present to the Let's Encrypt board a proposal to sort of do roughly something along these lines a while back. And I believe the feedback from that board at the time was roughly, we don't see any users for this. I may be misstating that, but I think it was roughly that. So I think that we should, sort of work on this case. The other direction that could possibly happen is you can imagine the mobile OS vendors, if they were willing to work with the carriers, directly get the certs into the OSs and then have a way not to give the cert directly to the applications, but allow the applications to access it in some rational way. I think that'd be another path. But I think we should probably sort of sketch out a few of the different directions we might be able to do this and then pursue them all simultaneously.
Hi. Plus one to what Colin just said, but I'm confused about the linkage between the certificate, which is traditionally used to sign a passport, and the ratchet tree that is a basic fundamental object that is deciding what the shared secret is that everybody in the messaging chat, whatever environment, are sharing. And can you explain the linkage you have in mind between the passport?
We talked about this yesterday. I have this naive notion there must be some way to take that shaken instrument in defiance, by the way, of what is the current certificate policy for the GA in the US.
I realize that part would have to change.
But that somehow is signing over whatever in the ratchet tree is, and I don't know the right way to do that. I asked you to solve this problem for me. I know the requirement. The requirement is there should be some way to bind that credential up to the shaken PKI and its chain of authority. Exactly how that plugs into MLS or to OpenID,
No, because you need to join the ratchet tree, you need a Diffie-Hellman key. Yes. So you'd have to authenticate that by signing the Diffie-Hellman public with your passport, or into the passport, or with the cert.
With the cert, probably, rather than into the passport, as far as I'm currently understanding it. But again, you guys know more about this than me. I just like design STIR, man. So you tell me how to do this.
Yeah. Chris Scola, my understanding is that people don't really use phone numbers for messaging, so I don't know if we can solve this problem.
We've reached that stage of the IETF.
Yeah, exactly. The troll stage. Yes. So I think it's probably, I agree that doing something here, actually really, really nice. It seems to me there's a number of ways one can kind of conceptualize what we're doing. I mean, so if we just really step back, the idea is to bridge the PKI, which we've nicely created for telephony into MLS. That's the objective, right? So one can imagine a number of ways in which one might do that. I think perhaps starting at the most arm's length relationship, which would be effectively, I think Colin was sort of hand waving at, which is using STIR to authenticate effectively an ACME issuance, and then from then on you simply use the ordinary PKI without reference to STIR in any way, right? Which would be roughly analogous to how the web system works, right? That's the most arm's length relationship. And on the on the sort of least arm's length relationship, you would actually use the STIR credentials directly to authenticate your entry into the MLS system. And I think you sort of hinted at this the other day, where perhaps those keys would not in fact even be possessed by the end user device. They'd be actually just signed by the there's some version of this where basically it's easy to think about when you're doing the external join, where where I would send my external join and it would have my Diffie-Hellman key, as Russ says, and that would just be signed by some key for the provider that I never even had access to. Yeah, I never had access to. I have a little trouble by the way reasoning about the properties of that system.
So we know that the security of that system sucks. However, it could be very useful in some small cases.
I'm not fighting you. I'm just saying I have trouble reasoning that private systems. Some thought would need to be done. There's probably some intermediate version, which I think is kind of the one you're hinting at here a little bit, where I would have my own public key, but it'd be attested to by that, which is another layer direction. I think it would certainly be nice, I think, to have something which is consistent with the key transparency kind of design. So, the version you carry here, one would imagine, a KT mode for it. It's not really desirable to have the situation where the provider can like continuously impersonate me. Even of course if they do my number, so like it's like a limited kind of situation. So yeah, I think a lot of things to do here. I think it'd be nice to sort of my natural instincts is I've got a very loose coupling, as I sort of indicated earlier, but perhaps that doesn't work. But I think there's definitely like, I'd love to see a draft forthcoming, because I think doing something would be good, and having the first thing doing anything is having something like bad.
Well, and to be clear, so I talked to Barnes about this just because he seems like he's lazy these days and isn't doing enough.
Yeah.
But like, if we want to get like a little design team together of people that are interested and actually want to make this happen, let's set up a call and like.
I'm interested in that.
Yeah.
Plus one, definitely interested in that. And I mean, I didn't realize we were actually going to like discuss something that's useful here. So
this is useful. We're fixing the world. Come on.
Oh, wait, didn't we kick you out of the room?
You know what IETF consensus is worth. So I think the direction that I'd like to see on this a little bit, as one of the starting points to sketch out a little bit, is so we use the STIR certificate gets revealed to Let's Encrypt, or let me call them Let's Call, since I don't think we're going to do it. Sure. I'm perfectly happy to fund a new organization called Let's Call or whatever like that, right? If it's not Let's Encrypt, but like we can get the funding together for an organization or get Let's Encrypt. There's an organization like that can verify caller ID, even if they do not have a lovely relationship with the carriers and the owners of the phone numbers. They issue verified credentials on that with proper certificate.
Which we would do through the Acme thing I was talking about that does proof of
yes,
protection.
exactly. Yeah, right. All those pieces coming together. So that's one way you can get a verified, or that's one way you can get attestation on that. The other way you can get on this is really designed for corporate identity is you go to CAA, the identity providers. We're working with a bunch of them, and some are about to go into live production, so that you can use your OAuth, your corporate single sign-on style stuff, however you think that works, and the many flavors of it. You can use that corporate identity to get an assertion. That way you get the same verified credential. And then we keep moving, we get several ways to get those types of verified credentials with different attestations to them, possibly even multiple ways. It's clear how you mix them together in that case. And then we use that to effectively sign the credentials that are used in the key package at the MLS level, right? And so I'd have one of, even though so here too, I'm trying to separate the device identities. Like I'm going to, like at the MLS level, each one of my devices is going to have a different key, I think is like the operational design. But I'd have one verifiable credential that I use to sign all of them and representing myself in that messaging group.
I mean, as far as I can tell, there's a lot of modularity between the credentials and those keys you're actually using for. Like,
for sure. Yeah. So, but I think that's there's an infinite number of sets of crap we could choose as a first pass of this problem, but that's the set that I would choose as a starting point to look at. Because it gets both a consumer version of it, it gets an enterprise version of it, and it fits very well into end-to-end encryption of the phone calls and messaging that everyone's doing. And
I also want the RCS in scope.
Sure. Yeah. Okay. That wasn't quite in my mind, but yeah, that would definitely. Would it work with that? Would that line up with it or not?
Well, it would look much more like the carrier side of it, right? Where you're effectively using the carrier credentials. And like, and it will have all the security properties that we're concerned about, right? But yeah.
Right. But okay, so that's 3 use cases. That makes sense. But I mean, I think that the important thing is I want a solution that if I can assert my ID in multiple directions that people believe different ways, including possibly a way that, PHP would come talk about here, whatever, right? Like that, it's just that I have your you and I got exchange verified credentials at a time when we were not under attack, and later when we're under attack, all those sorts of properties.
Foolish things could be fine. Yeah.
Hello, Sean Turner, MLS chair. So the idea that Richard is not engaged is not actually true anymore. Hot off the presses from yesterday, the additional credential draft was we're going to run a working group adoption call because it was a slam dunk, like 24/0 on support of it. The reason why you might remember that from back in the day was because we were just trying to get the protocol done. So now we're in the process of adding extensions, and so one of the
I was there yesterday. I raised
my
hand
so
in that meeting.
It's all going to get slowly worked. I'm interested in following along this as well. So thanks.
Thank you, Sean.
One last comment. When I said the 3 different use cases, I think it's interesting. Let me state what I said was it has a direct bearing on this piece, right? It's who is going to be able to speak authoritatively to this identity of the user. One case one is like totally over the top, which is where we do the mobile number verification, where like, you know, you could make a let's call or let's encrypt or whatever, and it can be used by WhatsApp and Facebook Messenger, and it's good for the OTT providers. There's a corporate use case that Colin just described. And then the third one is interesting, is the RCS case, where the messaging provider and the telco are the same.
Yes.
And that's the case where
It's most obvious what you do.
where the STIR, specifically, like the first two have nothing to do with STIR. Like they have to do with phone numbers, but they don't have anything to do with STIR.
So they have to do a STIR insofar as 8226, you know, the certificate that's being issued will attest the number.
Okay. So we would use we would use the certificate format, but nothing really else.
Yeah, like
Not
I
the
said, I'm not
passport.
even sure we'd use 8225. Like we need to use passport.
Yeah.
We'll just use TNAuthList to be like, this telephone number is what we're attesting in the
Yeah,
cert.
yeah, it's like in that sense, it's STIR. It's STIR certificate. Yep, fair enough. But it doesn't involve the carriers. That's
In that instance, it does
or the
not.
passports. Yeah. Okay.
All right. Well, we have 5 minutes left. I think we've talked this. We have a plan. Let's find some time to have a design team meeting in the not too distant future to discuss all the interesting potential angles around MLS for this. I have no further other business for the group, but do the chairs have anything? Or
Do you need the chairs to organize that design team, or is it
it
self-organizing?
would be so helpful.
Okay.
We can do that.
Can the note taker remind the chairs later that we need to do that?
Okay, just a reminder of the action items I saw. We're going to have one more update to the connected identity document, then do working group last call. We're going to merge draft Peterson STIR certificates, OCSP, STIR OCSP staple into the current OCSP document, and we're going to see short-lived have a call for adoption. Those were the three things I saw. Did I miss anything? Organized design team. Okay. Cool. Thank you.
I'm glad we had a 2-hour session.
Yeah, good thing we had a 2-hour
session. The chairs thought this was going to be about a half-hour meeting.
To me, it's ultimately ironic that we have this tiny working group that works on what is arguably the most significantly impacting piece of technology to come out of the IETF. I just find that fascinating. Besides, I mean, there's IP2, but at least in the like. Yeah.